Hi, I'm Dr. David Day of Samurai Digital Security, and this is 404 Cybersecurity Not Found, tearing cybersecurity a new arse since 2015.
We're joined today by Dr. David Day as usual, but this week we have a special guest, John Strand from Black Hills InfoSec, and we're going to be talking about risk in general today, as well as a few news stories. But first, John, can you just introduce yourself a little bit? Tell us about Black Hills and,
Yep, you bet. So my name is John Strand. I am the owner of Black Hills Information Security. I taught with the SANS Institute for roughly 15 years before I retired. We specialize in network penetration testing, incident response, security operations services. Basically, just like you guys, we're trying to make the world a safer place for people. And sometimes we all feel like we're losing. So
Thanks for that, John.
you bet.
Yeah, it's an uphill struggle at times getting people to listen to us, but we still get up every day and try our best to make the world a better place. So recently there's been quite a few large hacks in the news. We can't go into too many details on each one of them, but I think most recently, at least, quite a few are down to remote access points as a point of entry. So what do we think is the reason for that, thinking about home working and remote access in general?
I think that we're kind of seeing that a little bit from just the nature of COVID, right? A lot of people started working from home, and automatically they're outside of that coverage of the network that was protecting them. Part of me doesn't really think it would make that much of a difference, even if the users were on their company network, because we talk about all kinds of really neat attacks that happen. We get excited about speculative execution, Rowhammer, Spectre, Meltdown, whatever the VMware exploit du jour is. And the reality is, a whole bunch of these compromises actually boil down to the simple things that we see again and again and again, mainly things like spear phishing. You compromise a user's workstation and then you pivot from there. And it's interesting to me just how underprepared so many organizations are for that type of attack.
Dave, what do you think some of the things we can do to prepare ourselves?
Right. Okay. Well, I think John made some really good points there. You know my view on this, Brad. We've talked about it before, but I always think the starting point should be making sure you're aware of what your risks are. A risk assessment. To going through and identifying first of all, potentially who the threat actors are. If somebody's going to try and breach you, if somebody's going to try and hack you, if somebody's going to try and put ransomware on your systems, who's going to be doing that, and why would they be doing it? Who are the threat actors, and what's their motivation? What are they likely to be gunning at you for? And then also thinking about in terms of how your business operates. What are the critical aspects of your business that can be turned over? Could stop you making money? Could stop your business being operational? And trying to prioritize those sort of high impact assets, if you like, those high impact incidents, trying to prevent those from happening. So getting your priorities right with a proper risk assessment first, and understanding your business processes and making sure that they don't break down. So I think they're good starting points, at least.
But I think that it's hard, right? I mean, understanding your business assets, it's amazing to me how many organizations we go into and we basically say, what is the differentiator for your company? Like, I do not care. And we're talking companies now. We won't get into classified things of that nature yet, but I do not care about what you do. What I want to do is understand what makes you unique in the marketplace, right? Because that is your differentiator. And the thing that's shocking is how few executives in any industry, in any market vertical, can actually answer that simple question, especially whenever you're discussing things like intellectual property level attacks. And it's just weird. And you always get these answers, not always, but from the companies that don't have it together. What's our differentiator? Our people. We have the best people in the industry. I don't know. Our company's
Yeah.
100,000 people, but it just feels like a small company. It's like they don't care about their people. So I think that that's somewhat difficult to try to like pull out of an organization because that data is there. You got to reach in, got to talk to the right people to get it. The other thing that I want to talk about whenever you're talking about risk, ultimately, if you boil down risk to its simplest core levels, it's threats and vulnerabilities, where threats and vulnerabilities overlap. And of course, you can have assets and impact and all those other things, but you have to have those too. And whenever you're looking at organizations and they start trying to address threats and vulnerabilities, the threat side of it, I think, is problematic because they get into these threat intel feeds. They want to look at what are these threat actors actually doing, and then they try to defend against that. And I think that that's an incredibly horrible way to live your life. And the reason why is kind of the blind philosophers and the elephant. You have a whole bunch of blind philosophers, and they're all touching an elephant. And they're all describing the elephant based on what they can feel. So one's describing the trunk, one's describing the foot, one's describing the tail. And the problem with that whole methodology is whenever somebody writes up an attack methodology for APT 29 or Fin 7 or any of these different groups, they're describing one aspect of that elephant and one attack that group did. And as humans, we get into this tragic mistake of thinking, well, that's what they're going to do all the time. And the reality is, offensive operations are fraught with failure, trial and error, and they will adapt. So if you think that an attacker is going to follow one specific type of methodology or a handful of techniques, you're fundamentally wrong. Those threat actors are going to use any techniques that are at their disposal. So trying to really get your head wrapped around those two concepts, like what is our company? What really is our company? And then what are threat actors doing is I think it's hard. I think it's really, really hard because we don't have solid information as security teams in many scenarios to answer those two questions.
Okay, that's interesting. So I take your point on intellectual property, in particular, and where your business has value, and of course, the threat to that is significant, and being able to identify exactly what that is.
Mm-hmm.
And like you say, that the old sort of, what is it that makes your company different? Yeah, it's our people, or many other stereotypical cliche
Yeah.
type responses. And when you dig down, if a company is successful,
Mm-hmm.
if a company is doing well, there's normally a reason or a few
There
reasons for
is.
why.
Yep.
So I think, yeah, identifying what they are, I would agree with you, is critical there. And then obviously being very cautious in terms of making sure that they're not going to be under threat. So yeah, certainly take your point on that one.
So, what do you think the best approach is to start protecting an organization?
So one of the things that I'm trying to get more organizations to do is look at the idea of vulnerability assessments in a larger context. And this isn't just companies. I've talked to people from Rapid7, I've talked to people from Tenable, and whenever you sit down and talk with these companies, and they're trying to talk about where they want their product offering to go in the vulnerability management marketplace, it reminds me of a quote from Henry Ford. Henry Ford was once asked, do you talk to your customers to figure out what your customers want? And Henry Ford, being kind of a crotchety, evil human being he said, no, because if I went to my customers and originally asked them what they wanted, they would have wanted a bigger, faster horse. And I think that that's what's going on in the vulnerability management space right now. So vulnerability management companies go and talk to their customers, and they're like, "What do you want?" And the customers basically say, "Oh, we need prioritization." That's really what we need. We need to prioritize what it is that needs to be addressed and in what order. And then the vulnerability management companies try to do that and do it wrong in very, very spectacular, expensive, and beautiful fashion. They do it wrong, and then they completely ignore what is actually going on in the industry with adversarial emulation. So if you look at vulnerabilities in companies, traditionally we look at vulnerabilities as this CVE is missing off of this server, or it's a misconfiguration, and we got to install these patches. We're going to run these tools to find these missing patches, and then we're going to install those patches. If you look at the MITRE attack technique matrix, that's two. That's two squares, right? And you teach CREST, right? Pen testing out of the UK, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Now, whenever you're teaching CREST pen testing, exactly how much time do you spend on running a vulnerability scanner, right? I mean, that's maybe a module. And then there's this huge amount that deals with lateral removal, Active Directory vulnerabilities, and traditional vulnerability assessment tools absolutely miss huge sections of the MITRE ATT&CK technique matrix. So one of the things I think that we need to do is we need to take this adversarial emulation thing, this game that's kind of this fringy, early adopters, cool kids are doing it type thing. And it really needs to be mainlined right into vulnerability management. We should have vulnerability scores for things like, overprivileged workstations where the user, the local domain users group is in the local administrator group. That should have a risk score, right? That should have like a high risk score. But right now they're occupying two separate areas. So organizations, when they think of vulnerabilities, they're looking at a very small percentage of the overall vulnerabilities that exist in the organization. And as an industry, we need to be incorporating that threat emulation. Some people call it simulation. It needs to be rolled into vulnerability management across the board, because now when you're looking at vulnerabilities, you're looking at it much more holistically. And you can tie it into stopping the attacks, look at Bloodhound and all the things that it does, stopping those attacks, but then also making sure that our detective controls are in place and working as well. So I think that that's one of the first steps that organizations need to start taking, is stop looking at this very, very narrow band view of vulnerability management and start expanding it to adversarial emulation, especially in the area of post-exploitation.
I'm really pleased actually that you talked about that, because it's a bugbear of mine as well. To be fair, the confusion that there seems to be between vulnerability assessment and proper sort of red team penetration testing type activities. You ask the layperson, what the difference is, and they're going to struggle to tell you. And you're absolutely right. So, for example, you do a system penetration test. The minority of your time is spent running a Nessus scan or whatever it might be to try to identify the basically low hanging fruit. And let's be fair, right? That what they're good at is finding missing patches. That's usually what they do well, right? This DLL's out of date. This version needs to be updated. But all the stuff that requires intelligence and creative thought, they can't do, right? We're not at that point yet. I have my doubts that we'll ever get there, even with the beautiful panacea of AI and machine learning, which they keep telling us will do everything for us. So yeah, I totally take your point on that, and I think it's something the industry needs to understand better as well. And you're right as well in terms of simulation. I know you guys do a lot of that, and we do too, to try to better emulate, what an attacker would do. I mean, I'm not saying don't do it, right? But simply setting up a scanner to check your systems is certainly isn't going to be enough.
And isn't that kind of, what we're talking about is fighting against the inclination for many organizations to meet the minimum? Because if you look at a lot of executives, kind of going back to that whole concept of executives, right? If you go back to executives, they want to know, okay, where's the checklist manifesto for being secure? Like, what do I have to buy? What do I do? What things do I do in my organization? And then when I'm done, can I be rid of these security people? Because we're kind of weird. We talk about all kinds of weird acronyms and things that make them uncomfortable. And I don't know, we know dark arts like dark magicians, right? And they want to just get secure, and then they don't want to think about it again. And I think that many organizations are waking up to the fact, albeit very slowly, that that's not the way security works. It's not an Easter egg hunt. You're not going to be in a situation where magically you found all the security vulnerabilities. Congratulations, thou is secure. It requires that continuous assessment, that continuous evaluation, and that continuous reevaluation again and again and again. And I think that that's a hard pill for some executives that don't have experience in this area to swallow.
Yeah, the sort of the mindset that, okay, well, we've had our pen test, we're good now. That sort of one hit thing. Just and then what amazes me is you sometimes it's a whole year, right, before you see them again, and you go back the following year. And even with a year, two things, right? First of all, it's always quite surprising to find, unfortunately, that the changes on, or that you highlighted, haven't taken place. But secondly, the infrastructure changes so tremendously in a year that you can't possibly imagine, with the influx of new systems and new software. And of course, we're in this cloud arena now, and so much working from home, and people are taking control of their own systems, and the CRMs are online, and the boundaries are being weakened, the perimeter is dissolving, and so the threats, they happen so fast the threat landscape, if you like, the attack surface increases so quickly over 12 months that you can't possibly think that, or you shouldn't be thinking that you can deal with this with a pen test once a year.
Well, and that gets into something, if we're going to get into some recent stories, the United States government, the Biden administration had put out a kind of a decree that says, thou shalt start moving everything to the cloud and thou shalt start implementing zero trust. And I think that those are noble goals, right? But my concern, and I think the CEO of Randori, I can't remember his name right now. He just wrote up an article that I think was very well thought out and very well written, where he basically said those are all great things, right? Like moving to the cloud and trying to do zero trust, that's awesome. But trying to push it and trying to rush that to happening is a dangerous oversimplification of kind of moving to that cloud centric zero trust model. And while companies have been doing this naturally, I think that progression makes sense. You think about it because enterprises are not just something you can pick up and drop into the cloud super easy and do it in a secure fashion. So I'm a little bit concerned, with my own government on this side of the ocean, where they're basically now pushing out all government agencies to very quickly move to the cloud as fast as they can, because that introduces a whole bunch of complexity and errors in trying to rush things. And as you both know, I think we've mentioned this before, honestly, complexity is the enemy of computer security, and trying to very rapidly transition an Active Directory traditional DMZ firewall environment into cloud, let's say in 12 to 24 months, is just a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, I agree, and also we're still relatively in the infancy, in terms of securing the infrastructure. So you can make the boxes secure, you can make the software secure, but then you put it into an infrastructure which you don't fully understand, and have people organizing that in a way they don't understand, AWS buckets and the rest of it, and they're not configuring them right. And actually, what you then do is you introduce vulnerabilities by moving into the cloud. So you're right. We have to get that side of it right too. I'm interested to hear your views on software application vendors now. I mean, over here we have it a lot, and we have it with critical infrastructure as well, and it worries me. I wish I could talk about some of the incidents I've been involved in, but you know as well as I do that we can't do that, right? But we've come across a number of software applications which are holding very sensitive data that affect all of us in the UK, that are vulnerable, quite badly vulnerable. But there doesn't seem to be anything in place in the UK. There isn't, at least, to regulate these people. To say, you can't just roll this piece of software out without having it fully security tested, and that's happening over here. I don't know if it's the same in the US.
It is, and I think that I think that it's happening. Like you talk about cloud security, and it's happening because being first to market is everything, right? You want to get this application out as quickly as possible, and then you also have a whole bunch of people that are. I don't know why it is, but it feels like every 5 6 years ago, we'll call them new generations of developers, somehow find the need to develop a whole new coding language, right? Like they'll go, oh, we're going to use Golang, we're going to use Angular, we're going to use Rust, we're going to use this, and it's like,
Swift.
so yeah, it's like all of a sudden, it's like, what the problem is with secure coding is it's all C and C++. But let's develop a new coding language. We're going to create Java, and it's like that'll make things secure, and that kicked off that first domino, and it's just been repeating itself again and again and again. So you have a whole bunch of people writing in brand new languages, and they're not very good, even though they have, they may have like, the whole hipster kind of ambiance about them. They still aren't very good because the language is new and they're new at developing. So I agree, but I think that that's been a consistent problem for the past 20 years. One of the problems that we're seeing, I think, that bothers me even more than crappy software getting rolled out is legacy software. And that crappy new software becomes a legacy software problem eventually. And the problem I have with the legacy software is I talk to all of these industries, and they all are saying the exact same thing. They'll basically say things like, well, we're in medical and we have a lot of legacy software. We got, a whole bunch of dialysis machines and different sensors and things that keep people alive. And we can't just replace these things because they're really expensive and they're insecure and there's nothing that we can do about it. And our industry is completely unique. And then you go to operational technology, you go to SCADA ICS environments where they're running power grid and all this stuff. And they say, you know what? In our industry, we're unique in the fact that we have very, very old software and very old hardware that has to run. And if we don't do it correctly, people are going to die. And no one else in the world has these types of problems. And then you go to financial, and they're like, all of our infrastructure for banking is running on legacy AS400 systems. And it's very unique. It's very unique. It's very old hardware and it's very old software. And there's nothing that, can be done about it because we have exceptions. And the problem I have with that is that every single one of these verticals, right? They all think that they're precious, unique, completely different than any other industry. So they need to develop all of these different compliance rules that allows for exceptions for this really old software and hardware. And the fact of the matter is, while they're completely unique and special and specifically what they're doing, it's the same theme happening again and again and again. And ultimately, very few of these industries, for all their compliance, all their certification, all their accreditation, they always create these massive exceptions for legacy hardware and legacy software. And then it's almost like they just wash their hands of it and they're like, well, we got an exception. We're good. Like, no, you still have a Solaris 9 box at the heart of your organization. What are you going to do to take care of that? Oh, we took care of it because we have this exception here. Okay, great. You've got that exception. What's your plan to fix it? We got an exception. Don't make me tap the exception again. So I love that thought of like this crappy software. Crappy software is something that stays with us forever. And we've got to come up with an idea, not as just a security industry, but IT as a whole. There has to be a plan for retiring the software and this hardware at some point.
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. And just for clarity, you and I both know that this isn't a rarity. People think that we're describing a situation which rarely happens, but you go in and you start looking into an organization, you find it regularly, these very old proprietary systems and that people are terrified about touching. And the guy who wrote the software or created the software, retired probably like 10 years ago, and wouldn't have a clue about it now anyway. And they keep it running there, opening up the company to risk. And your point, I identified with completely when you said about they can turn around, they can say, well, look, if we stop this software, lives will be lost. And I've heard that as an argument, right? And then you turn around, and I know you guys had big issues when WannaCry hit too, and over here, I don't know if you heard about it, but our whole NHS system was flagged.
I remember that.
And we had people who were needed critical operations that didn't have critical operations. Now, I'm not saying they died, but you think it through, it's a likelihood. So it's like, what about the other side, right?
No, absolutely. And I think that the fundamental problem boils down to, if every single one of these market verticals believes that they're precious, unique snowflakes, then they believe that they're dealing with a problem that is unique to them, and they can create these magical exceptions where they don't have to worry about securing things. And I want to make it clear, I understand, right? I understand the fact that dialysis machines and X-ray machines and all these things that hospitals have are really expensive. I understand the fact that the technology that we put for making the power grid work is really expensive. I understand that updating classified systems is really, really, really pricey. But my point on all of this is, at the very least, we need to somehow force organizations to develop a plan of when these systems are going to be retired and how they're going to retire them, because they're going to retire one way or the other. Like, it's going to happen. I mean, everything degrades, everything dies. I personally would like my hospital, my bank, my power company to have a plan for starting to kind of phase out those ancient technologies a little bit more controlled.
Yeah, we've got a thing over here, and whether it's going to work or not, I don't know. This new NIS regulation that's come out, which is the idea behind it is that it's going to try to make and then there's this like CAF framework, which is supposed to help us to prevent critical infrastructure systems, being exposed to the kind of problems you talk about. But I look at those sometimes and wonder, well, how can it be enforced? And it's a really interesting problem. How do you persuade people that now is the time to retire that system and put something new in place? I mean, do we go with stick? Do we go with carrot? Do we make it law? Because you're right. At the moment, it's not working, is it?
No, it's not. That's one of the things I like about GDPR. And you're more an expert in GDPR than I am because we don't deal with it as much here in the United States, even though it does pop up from some of our customers. But I like GDPR because it's an accountability framework. I always thought it was funny whenever people would call me up and they're like, "Oh my gosh, GDPR is coming up. We need to be compliant with GDPR." It's like GDPR isn't going to tell you how to patch your systems. GDPR isn't going to tell you, how you should configure your servers. GDPR is basically saying if things go sideways and you're negligent, you're going to get fined. And I almost wonder, and I'd love to get your all's opinion on this. I almost wonder if that's not a better way to live in the industry, because whenever you create a compliance standard, let's just go back to, I use this all the time, the NIST Green Book. NIST Green Book came out in 1985, and it said that passwords should be 8 characters long, and at a maximum, we should change them every 6 months. And you move to today. And in the NIST Green Book, it talks about a 300 baud modem. You can do so many password guesses over this particular time, 1 in 1 million probability of guessing the password. And they basically come up with this table where they say we should change our passwords once every 6 months and they should be 8 characters long. And still today, you have compliance frameworks that say that your password should be 8 characters long because they've built it upon a framework that was built 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 upon the NIST Green Book for password complexity. So I have this problem with compliance frameworks, and PCI is the worst because it's currently 7 characters. Where these compliance frameworks, where we try to tell people how to secure things, 2 things happen. One, they quickly become out of date. 2, they don't really age well, right? Sorry, one, they go out of date very quickly, and 2, everybody uses them as just a guide to meet the minimum. So I almost feel like we need to move into these accountability frameworks. It's like if you get hacked and it impacts, I don't know, like a huge portion of a country, then you're going to get fined. And those fines will be defined in tables, and it's not going to be something that's going to be like, oh well, we lost $1 million to ransomware. It's going to be a significant fine that's actually going to hurt your organization. If we can start doing that, I think that executives and lawyers and also insurance companies will stand up, take notice that this isn't just something that they can just write off for a couple $1 million. This is significant, and it will financially hurt the organization. So I'd love to get your opinion because you live with GDPR far more than I do. Do you feel like that as an accountability framework has been effective, or is it just another compliance thing that just kind of like goes over the head of many security professionals?
No, it's definitely made a difference. There was definitely a jump in terms of people's awareness and push to improve data privacy. You're quite right, though, in terms of the amount of cybersecurity that GDPR covers. So if you were to Venn diagram it, you'd have cybersecurity the size of the sun and GDPR the size of the moon, and it would just be covering a small part of it. So there's a huge discrepancy between the two. There's an awful lot more cybersecurity than GDPR. However, the threat posed by in the UK, the ICO is significant. It can be enough to put a company into danger. Now, what I do find interesting from what you've just said, and I'd not really thought about it until you said it, actually, but the NIS framework, which we're trying to get going in the UK here, is a bit like GDPR in the fact that, well, at least part of it is regulated by the ICO as well as GDPR is. So, and you can be fined, right, for non-compliance. But it doesn't apply to all companies. It just applies to telcos, I think, and critical infrastructure at the moment, at least. But it is one where if you don't meet the standards, you will be held accountable to it in the same way that GDPR is. So it's a small step, but possibly, depending upon if it works or not, and it is definitely too early to say right now. Yeah, I think it's a case of watch this space with that one, because if it works, then maybe that utopian dream that you projected may come true. Accountability as opposed to to frameworks. And you're right about the frameworks, by the way. It's a rhetoric which I speak about myself. So if you consider, and you know what, if they're done well, like really well by the right people, then they mean something in my view. So if you look at something like, for example, ISO 27001, and you mentioned to me, you said just now that that they age, and they do. If you look at 27001, for example, the original publication for that, which was the 7799 BSI framework, was published in 1995. And a lot of it is still in there, right? And that's a cracky. I don't know. That's what, 30 years ago,
Yeah.
35 years ago plus.
Feeling really old now. Yeah.
Really, really old, yeah. So 25 actually, my mistake. And then if you, even if you look at the revisions, it was revised in 2005 and then revised again in 2013. So even the latest edition of it is like 8 years old. So, and we're relying on those frameworks heavily. I think it's okay as long as the person that's actually pushing it forward brings it up to date themselves. It's a strength and a weakness, right? Because the interpretation of the frameworks just varies so tremendously. Because we do ISO 27001, right? And we've gone into organizations and we've done work with them and we said, you guys really need ISO 27001. And they say, we've got ISO 27001. We're like, how? How?
It's interesting how political it is, right? Like I talk about PCI and the 7-character password limit. I started ripping on PCI on Twitter because that's what any sane, rational, mature human being will do, and just started making jokes about 7-character passwords. One of my favorites was Teen Vogue has better password complexity recommendations than PCI. And I was begging PCI, can they at least meet the Teen Vogue standard of passwords? Just kind of having fun. And I had some people contact me like, dude, you don't want to mess with PCI. Those guys will mess you up. And I had this vision of like geeky gang people running around on mopeds. And, it's just weird. But there's politics in all of it. And the politics of things like compliance and interpretation are always difficult, right? You always get into one auditor's view over another auditor's view. The one group that I think matters, though, and I'm still waiting. Mongolese was an interesting thing. You were talking about Petya, not Petya WannaCry, out of Ukraine. But how long will insurance companies be paying out for these things? I think we can talk about legislation. We could talk about certification and accreditation compliance frameworks all day. But whenever you have an insurance company or insurance companies that look at a company that's been compromised and they basically say, look, you had no vulnerability management, you had no patch management, you had no user awareness training, you had no base due diligence of computer security, and now you got hit with ransomware, and you want us to pay you $1 million to pay for that? No, we're not going to pay. And that's not exactly what happened with Mongolese. What happened with Mongolese was they said it was an exception under an act of war, because it was hot nation state on nation state action. And one of the things that I think eventually starts to change and push the industry is these subtle things, right? Like ransomware has increased the security of organizations far more than any audit and compliance framework could, because you learn that the frying pan is hot, that it's visceral. You don't just get hacked and the attackers stay there for months. You get hacked and you find out about it immediately. And there's something in our human psyche that allows that to switch on. But when you start looking at these subtle undercurrents, as insurance companies basically start telling companies that have cyber insurance, you know what? No, you got hit. You paid $1 million for a ransomware. No, we're not going to pay. And I know that you have heard this, where companies have literally looked at the cost of security and they basically compared that to the cost of insurance. And they said, cost of insurance is cheaper. We're not going to do the secure thing because we have insurance. I really think that insurance companies are getting sick of being that last final net. And I think that you're going to start seeing insurance companies start to push back against ransomware payments for companies that don't do basic security.
Right. Well, there's a couple of things from that. The first thing is I'm actually working with. I won't mention the name of the insurance company because I'm not a fan of being sued.
Yeah.
But
especially by insurance companies, right?
Yeah, that's not good. Yeah. So I'm working with a company at the moment, and we're trying to get a payout from an insurance company. From what I see is a pretty cut and dry case, and I've never seen so many clauses being pulled out.
Mm.
To be fair, I have seen it work the other way where they have paid out, but it's certainly, there's no guarantee at any point whether you're going to get paid out or not. And we've worked with companies where they've been breached, and we've gone in there, we've done an incident investigation. And then another company has suddenly been introduced to do their own investigation on our investigation. And that company is being employed by the insurance company. So it's almost like loss reduction companies where they come in and they reevaluate the loss to try to reduce it, to reduce the amount they pay, and that goes out too, right?
Let's do that.
And
We
there's
need we need to start a company. We're going to start an insurance loss reduction company where we can help insurance companies. Like whenever a company wants $1 million payout, we do an assessment and we're like, you know what, they should get 60%. I joke, but that's where this is going, right?
Oh, it exists. I know. Honestly, what your joke there, that I obviously can't name the company. Brad, you know who it is, right? But there was a company that actually working with us, and that's exactly what they were doing. There's this thing, isn't there, called I like my psychology, right? And there's this thing called the certainty effect. People will they'll make the choice. They'll think, well, if I go with cybersecurity and I put cybersecurity services in place, it will definitely cost me X amount of money, right? If I have a breach, it might cost me X amount of money. First of all, they don't know the likelihood of them having the breach, and secondly, they don't know how much money it is. And they look at that, and this cognitive bias of certainty effect thinks, I would rather pay no money, right? And because I'm not certain that there will be get a breach. Because if I do pay some money, I know that money's definitely gone, and it's a known failing of our rationale and our reason and our thinking. And yeah, it's a terrible
So
problem.
here's a horrible story, kind of on that note. We were hired to do a pen test for a company, and they had a brand new CISO that came in, and she was sharp. She came in and she brought us in, and she basically, look, I want to know where the bodies are buried. I want to know how bad security is in this company, because she went through their audit and compliance framework docs and their certification and accreditation, and everything looked like it was in order and everything looked good. And she looked at the firm that was doing the testing, and she realized this is a firm that'll basically always make you look good. Like, I won't say the name of the company, but you'll go through and they'll do the, like, yes, your security is A+, top 1% of their industry market vertical. She called us in and she goes, this doesn't feel right to me. And we went through and it was a nightmare. They actually had live production applications. You remember in Access, you can create an Access database and then generate a web page for that Access database. They literally had production apps that were Access database generated apps that they were running. It was bad, all the way down. They were still running Windows XP in some places. That most of the company was at Windows 7, except for the executives where she was at, where they went to Windows 10. It was really, really bad. And she called me in and into her office, and we were having a conversation about this. And she's like, "What do I do?" I brought this up to the board. I brought this up to the C-Os, and they basically shrugged and said, "Hey, if this other company says we're secure, um, we're not going to do anything to try to fix any of this." And she basically asked me, what do you think I should do? I said, "Look, here's what you do. You're going to get popped. This company is going to go down, and it's going to go down spectacularly." Because you don't have the support of the rest of management, the board of directors, to actually do the right thing. So I recommend that you stay here for 6 months to a year. And then your life goal should be, because you now have that CISO title, you go out and you find another CISO job as quickly as you possibly can, because there's very little way that you're going to be able to impact change here. And I know that people will listen to
Wow.
this podcast will be like, well, you can always impact change if you do it correctly. Motherhood and apple pie and freedom and whatever. But look, I've been doing this long enough. I know whenever I sit down and I talk to a CEO, and he's kind of like that Western Texan, and you start talking about security, and he's like, "Oh, I tell you what, I don't have to be the fastest man in the woods. I just have to be faster than the slower guy, so that bear gets him. Am I right?" And as soon as I hear that from a CEO, I'm like, I don't want to work with this company. And that's kind of the situation she was in. So sure enough, she got to the end of that particular time. I actually think it was about 7 or 8 months. And she ended up jumping to another financial services company that took security seriously. And probably a month after she left, that whole entire company got burnt to the ground by ransomware. So, it's kind of hard to look at these different things and talk about what we can do, especially with legacy systems, legacy applications, if that will is not there throughout the entire company to improve security as a whole, I oftentimes tell security professionals today, look, the market is wide open for people that have experience, certifications in computer security. There's no reason you should be working at a company that's miserable to work at. There's no reason you should be working at a company that doesn't support security initiatives. You got to find the good companies, and they're out there.
I have just one more point really, which I'd like to discuss, and I don't know whether you guys have had this. I do actually. I think I do know the answer, but I'll go ahead anyway. We have experienced on some occasions, at least, where we've gone in and we've done, risk assessments, penetration tests, red teaming activity, whatever it might be, to help ascertain the security of an organization. And we've produced a report, and we have, collective expertise behind that to try and best inform it. And then the report gets presented. And then maybe you know where I'm going, right? And then maybe about a few days later, we get a an email or a phone call and said, "Yeah, we've had a look at that, and we don't agree with it. We actually think on these particular points, we actually think that's not a problem. And please, can you amend the report to say everything's fine, if that's okay?" And we've hit that a few times, right? And that's I just wonder what your thoughts and views are on that, and if it's something you guys have experienced before.
So this is actually something I can say, yes, I know your problem. Here's the solution. So whenever a company hires us, unless it goes to a letter of attestation, I'll get to that here in a second, and I produce a report. And that report, let's say that I was talking about 7-character passwords because that happened last year and I'm still salty over it. It was a company, they were PCI based, underneath PCI. And we cracked every single password in their environment. And we said that this particular vulnerability was a high risk vulnerability for the organization. And they said, no, we don't think it is, because PCI says it's the minimum. And it's impossible for this to be a high risk if PCI says that this is the standard. And I can argue with them back and forth. So what I basically tell our customers is I say, look, you hired us to do an assessment. You hired us to do an assessment and offer our level of risk for your particular organization. I am not grading you. It may seem like I am, right? Like I'm coming in and I'm a grade school teacher giving you an F or a D or whatever. You can literally take my report. You can take my report that I sent you, and you can disregard everything because you're going to take my risk as part of your overall risk considerations. I'm not setting the risk score for you. I'm giving you my recommendation for that risk. So if you want to take my risks in my report and you want to change it to medium, you want to change it to low, you want to change it to fluffy bunnies, I honestly don't care. You hired me to give you my assessment, and this is my assessment. With it, you can do whatever you want. You can change your risks to whatever you want it to be. And there's a couple of reasons why this works. First, they understand my role. My role is to come in and give an opinion. My role isn't there to give them judgment. I give them a professional opinion based on 20 years of experience. And if they choose to disregard that, that's their prerogative. That's their choice. And I give them the ability to say, you need to take my risk score that I've given you and modify it for your plan of actions and milestones and your overall risk register that you have. And you can put it into your risk register however you choose to do it. And that gives us all breathing room, right? It's no longer me fighting them. They understand kind of where I'm coming from and my perspective. They understand that they have some level of control over the situation. And ultimately, what it buys me is two things. Number one, it buys me, I sent them the report. So if they end up getting hacked and they say, well, BHIS set this as low, I can say, no. The report I sent you, it was a high. I can defend myself. I'm in a defendable position at that point. If they choose to change the risk, that's their choice. The other thing that it does for me, and I think that this is really, really, really important, is this automatically outs them as a customer I never want to work with again. And that is a beautiful thing. At the end of the day. So that's how we've handled that. Now, if it gets to a letter of attestation, they've got to share with customers and auditors, completely different ballgame. If they are bad at security, I have to put in my letter of attestation, they're bad at security. Now, I'll use political language around that. Multiple vulnerabilities were discovered of high and critical nature, and currently the organization is implementing a systematic plan to address these particular vulnerabilities. I will put it in those types of things. I will not change a letter of attestation. In fact, I won't even change my report. But once again, if they want to change the findings that I sent them on a report in their own risk register, they can go ahead and do it. And that usually neutralizes the entire conversation very quickly.
We had a discussion about that very thing this morning, and we kind of reached the same
Yeah.
conclusion. So that's
Yeah.
interesting, that's actually good advice. And we're gonna, that
And it's kind of a bit of ego, right? I mean, to get down to it, we've been doing this a long time, and whenever we say, look, you have a SQL injection vulnerability and a get parameter in a web server, that's bad, and then they say, no, it's not. You're kind of like, I've been doing this for 2 decades. Like, you're not going to listen to me. And I think letting that go and basically being like, all right, sounds good. That's your call. By the way, here's the final report. Do with what you will. My invoice will be showing up here in the next couple of days. Thank you very much. And I put a little check box that next to that customer that says we've now fired that customer. We will not work with that customer again.
I was going to say there's a cognitive bias called the Dunning-Kruger
Oh,
cognitive bias, and it's exactly what you just said. It's where people overestimate their ability when they're not an expert. They consider their view to be superior to the expert they're paying to come in, and it's actually what a lot of conspiracy theories sort of explode because of this, because people are sort of think that their expertise is more than the expert. I don't want to go down the route, but the anti-vaxxers thing,
Oh,
right?
let's go down the
It's a
anti-vaxxers. Let's do 5G. Let's get into that. So, you can get into that. And that is the very reason, right? That is the very reason why I went the way that I went, is I realized that there was no way I could win that argument. Like, I could fight until I'm blue in the face. I could show them statistics. I could do analysis. I could say, here's a whole bunch of companies that have been compromised the exact same way. I could bring their mother into the room and have their mother tell them, look, John's right, and they still won't agree with me. So if I know that that's a foregone conclusion, I'm not going to expend the mental effort to fight that.
I get you. Yeah. What did he say? A person convinced against their will is still of the same opinion.
Oh, I
I
agree.
think I've
I
heard.
agree. And I say, as soon as you start arguing, you've lost the argument. No one has ever changed someone's mind through an argument, right? Like, you never get into an argument over politics or religion at the dinner table and then have your crazy uncle go, you're right. I agree with you. That doesn't happen. So why am I going to put effort into it? Now, what it does do is usually you have meetings and there's lots and lots of people in the room, and you're not trying to convince that person. You're trying to convince the rest of them. And it's this weird kind of subterfuge that happens. This has happened to me like 5, 6 times where I've gotten into an argument with the CISO or director of IT with a bunch of his people in the room. And for some reason, that director of IT doesn't make it that long at that company. And then I end up getting a phone call and they're like, yeah, you know that guy that you got into an argument with? I'm like, yeah, he no longer works here. And I'll be like, wait, give me a minute. And I'll go to our customer database and uncheck the fired box and be like, how can we help?
I often find it as well. Sometimes the higher up the organization you go, right, the more expertise they seem to think they have in your area. But that's
Yeah,
just my view.
yeah. That's. I can't remember. It was actually something based on a Tom Clancy novel. I can't remember. That's a different kind of effect, but it's basically like, I'm an expert, and whenever I read a news story about something in the security field, I'm like, this is garbage. Like, this is horrible. This person doesn't know what they're talking about. But then I read a news story about microbiology or quantum computing or something like that. I'm like, well, clearly that article is well written and they know what they're doing in that situation. But you're right. Like, you get these people that once you're an expert in something, you start to believe that you're an expert in absolutely everything. And you get in a room with Harvard MBAs, you get in a room with doctors. Oh my word, like medical doctors. Though you have worked with those people, I know you have, and they're almost impossible to have conversations with.
Oh, they are.
Um,
I tell you, if you talk, if you, you know what, I'm going to be careful. I'm going to back away from the
yeah, let's
conversation
do it.
actually,
Let's
because
do
I'm
it.
going to end
Let's
up
do
saying
it.
something that's going to get me into trouble.
I get into trouble quite a bit these days, but all right. Well, I got to get going, guys. So I wanted to say thank you so much for having me on, and it was great conversation. And hopefully we can get you guys out at Wild West Hackin' Fest. And I would love to get you both on a game of backdoors and breaches, at some point,
Love to do that.
and do that. I think
Love
that
to
that
do
would be
that.
great. So
It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, John. It really has, and an awful lot of fun. It's made my afternoon. Really appreciate your time. This podcast was brought to you by Samurai Digital Security, purveyors of cybersecurity solutions. Find us at samuraisecurity.co.uk and follow us on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. Samurai Security, tearing cybersecurity a new R since 2015.